Welcome here. It's an honor to have this opportunity to be up here and speaking to all of you. I would be lying if I said it's not a little bit intimidating. For those of you who are maybe a little bit less familiar with me, my name's Aeden. As I said, I've been the worship pastor here at Lakeview for just over a year. As a worship pastor, my job is usually not sharing my own words. I typically get to leverage other people's really artistic and engaging lyrics, people who are experts and professionals, in order to share biblical truths. And I feel a little bit naked up here without a guitar or a piano between me and you guys. A little bit about me on a personal level. I'm the husband to Kayla, a woman who's gracious enough to bear with me through my many eccentricities, as well as a pastoral schedule. And I'm a dad to 5 kids, Ivy, Audrey, Atlas, Broden, and Valor. I got all of them, I think. Most of them you've probably either heard or seen running around the building. Kayla and I have really taken it seriously to try and ensure job security for our student ministries for the next few years. You're welcome, Mitch. I'm a big nerd. I grew up on comic books, Star Trek and Star Wars, playing video games, and so having kids to share those things with has been great. I have a whole house full of people that can relate with me on a common level. When I was volunteered into the summer preaching schedule, I made sure that the powers that be, Paul, were aware that this is kind of my first time doing this. I've done some short form speaking, but nothing, in this scope or in a Sunday morning. And so I thought that he would take that into consideration. Maybe a short passage, right? Or a single chapter. I'm a worship pastor. We like to sing about fire or water or wind or elemental imagery. So I was expecting the burning bush or the parting of the Red Sea, all of which, that would be my wheelhouse. Apparently not. So today we continue our series in Exodus, and I'll be speaking on a nice short 7 chapters from 5 to 12. Judgment and plagues and darkness and boils and, really easy worship song material, right? And I will sing of the judgment of God. But yeah, growing up in the church, I come from a family of pastors and missionaries. I fell into the mold pretty easily. Typical firstborn, we're known for following rules and roles, expecting others to do that. I understood how things were supposed to be, especially the expectations that came with being a Christian. It was great. I knew where I belonged, what I should be doing. My high school years looked like what I would dream for my kids. Passionately involved in youth several nights a week, different churches, citywide ministry participation, learning to lead worship, learning to be part of a faithful peer group, Bible quizzing, which if you're not familiar with is exactly what it sounds like. I didn't face adversity in high school. People around me, my peers, didn't try and pressure me into drugs or partying or anything crazy. It was actually pretty comfortable for me. I hit every mark, confirmation, youth groups, summer camps. But in that, there was always this force or pressure to hit the next mark, driven by what others wanted me to do or expected me to do, or what I felt like I should be expecting from myself. What would make me good enough? More. Maybe more guidelines to follow or self-imposed standards to live by would be enough. Maybe if I memorized scripture better, maybe that would be enough. Maybe if I took on more ministry opportunities, that would be enough. If I led more people in worship, maybe that would be enough. More would be enough. And then all of a sudden, I wasn't in high school anymore. Now I'm a young adult. My story isn't super unique. Exhausted of these self-imposed boundaries, I think we can all kind of guess what happened next. Through my later teens, I discovered the so-called freedom of self-determination and took it and ran with it. Whatever I wanted to do, I did. In that exploration, I went from the kid doing ministry and going to youth several nights a week to bars and parties and lots of other unfortunate activities. And this isn't one of those testimonies that's about how bad things got. I'm fully aware that my experiences were really, really tame. And I completely look to the grace and faithfulness of God, that it was short and fairly unmemorable. I experienced my share of lows and enough bad decisions for a montage in a movie, but more importantly, I was led to realize something, that actually behind all of this was a familiar pressure. What would it take to feel satisfied? More. If I owned this, maybe that would be enough. If I went out another night this week, maybe that would be enough. If I had more of the right experiences, if I consumed more, bought more, did more, more would be enough. More would be enough. And I actually wasn't exploring opposite experiences, chasing religious freedom or religious achievement or indulgent experiences. I was following the same script, doing the same work, enslaved by the same lie, believing that freedom and fulfillment was somewhere just beyond the next accomplishment, experience, or purchase. And isn't this something that we all kind of face? The need to do more, the need to be more, the need to get more, the need to give more? John D. Rockefeller, whose net worth with inflation was $500 billion, was asked, how much money is enough? And he famously answered, just a little bit more. And this has been in us since Genesis. God has ordered existence, creating our world. Everything from resources to companionship, purpose, and role was provided. And then a serpent suggests that what God has provided is not enough. That there's more that we must do, more that we must take before it will be enough. And then death and disorder and chaos and oppression are brought into an ordered creation, consequences of mankind's choices to obey a different master. Which brings us to our passage in Exodus. In chapter 5, after returning to Egypt, Moses and Aaron come to Pharaoh and tell him that God, the God of Israel, has said Pharaoh needs to let the Israelites go to worship him. Pharaoh basically has a three-part response to this whole situation. First, he says, who? Second, no. And then to the overseers and slave drivers, the people in charge, he says, you are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They're lazy. That's why they're crying out. Let us go and sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the people so that they keep working and they pay no attention to lies. The Israelites were required to do backbreaking work, to provide a set number of bricks to meet a quota, and now Pharaoh is finding ways to make it more. The hardest physical labor I've ever done was working as a roofer. It's hot, it's hard, it's dirty physical work, usually in the sun, definitely not in the shade. And 20 years later, my body is still paying for it. Often we worked on tight deadlines to make it to the next roof just to do the same thing all over again. And even in that, we were lucky enough that the dozens of packages of shingles were delivered onto the roof. We didn't have to carry it up. I imagine that if I was suddenly required in the middle of a job to start carrying these bundles of shingles up the ladder and still hit the same deadlines, that there would have been problems. We'll call it spirited discussions and leave it to the imagination of what that would look like. What Pharaoh does is worse than that. They're already doing hard physical work, but now a key piece of brickmaking, one that's essential to them actually being able to complete the work, is no longer being provided. And they have to actually go and get it themselves. This isn't asking people to haul shingles up a ladder. This is asking them to hike to the shop, bundle it up yourself, haul it back to the job site, then up the ladder, and still complete it on the same timeline. For no other reason, the Pharaoh thinks that they need to work harder. The point isn't the bricks. The bricks are just the instrument. Domination is the goal. And I want to be clear here. The desire to work harder, to do more, isn't bad in and of itself. Hard work and labor are their own rewards, but that's when they're a means to accomplish something of value. When the end product is actually dependent on the quality of effort put in. But here, in this case, and like the examples I shared, the labor has no relationship to the result. I couldn't do enough to be good enough because the behaviors weren't what brought me close to God. I couldn't get enough to be satisfied because the experiences, the things that I pursued, the freedom I thought I was expressing had no relationship with actual freedom. Both demanded more work with no impact to the end goal that I thought I was pursuing, a different kind of slave master demanding a different kind of work. Pharaoh wants to break the spirit of the Israelites and keep them passive and captive. And he's doing it by increasing the meaningless work. The bricks aren't better. They're not getting more of them. It's actually harder to complete the task for no other reason than wanting to increase how much work is needing to be put in. And the question Pharaoh asks himself is, what would be enough to keep his slaves in their places? And from deep inside him, the answer is, more would be enough. And this is the context for the next few chapters, because the authors of Exodus are ensuring that everything is in perspective. Just in case anybody missed it, the point here is that Pharaoh and Egypt are bad, right? Like, just in case we didn't catch it, the subjugation of Israel, the taking of the Hebrew infants that have already been covered, here's one more reminder that there's an entire system, an entire empire being leveraged against God's people. And we're talking about this before the show starts, just to highlight what's going on against the people of Israel. Because Pharaoh's policy isn't separate from Egypt's theology. It's his right, because Egypt believes that he has a divine appointment to rule. Yahweh isn't confronting the quotas. He's confronting the system that allows Pharaoh to make these demands. Pharaoh says, "I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Pharaoh is a human deity to Egypt, the leader in a polytheistic culture. He's supposedly descended from their pantheon, a divine being to rule all of Egypt. Who is this apparent powerless God of the slaves who let his people be taken to make demands? Pharaoh is not going to entertain an appeal to that authority, let alone dialogue with it. And so Israel's in the midst of this culture and has been for hundreds of years, surrounded by the Egyptian pantheon, on display in everyday life, in the river, the sun, the localized practices that are around them. And that all answers this key question, a question that I've always had, of why God plans a confrontation like this, natural disasters and all. Because I always figured he could just have picked up his people and put them down where he wanted them. You know, God does the whole infinity gauntlet like Avengers Snap, and Israel's in the promised land. But this is actually a cosmic battle. It's a showdown, a full revealing to Israel of just who he is, and a demonstration for them and for us to remember going forward. God isn't sneaking his people away. He's not planning an elaborate heist, and he's not going to flee from the gods of the empire of Egypt. He's looking for this fight. The Lord replied to Moses in chapter 6, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of a strong hand, he will let them go. And because of a strong hand, he will drive them from his land. Therefore, tell the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from the forced labor of the Egyptians and rescue you from the slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. You will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the forced labor of the Egyptians." It's not just a rescue, it's a reclaiming, it's a demonstration of his authority and power. So the stage is set. In one corner, Pharaoh at the front of the Egyptian pantheon, and the Lord in the other. The Egyptian empire, an earthly representation of the power of their many gods, who do their work of protecting and enforcing the divine rule of Pharaoh, each with their spheres of influence credited with holding all things how they should function. The sun rising and setting, the Nile flowing, the prosperity of livestock and crops, the balance of nature. And I'm not gonna lie, the Egyptians have some pretty cool gods. Happy, the Nile god. Heket, the goddess of fertility and childbirth. Osiris, the Egyptian god of death and resurrection. Ra, the sun god, who's considered the high god of the pantheon. And then there's Pharaoh, the god king, exercising his will over Egypt, backed by the power of divine appointment and supposedly by the entire Egyptian pantheon behind him. And in the other corner, there's Yahweh, the God of the slaves, a burning bush. To Pharaoh, a no-name, inconsequential God that doesn't even register. From his perspective, there's no argument here. Pharaoh in his mind is rightly dismissive because there's no great battle to be had. And he's right, but super, super wrong. Because yes, there is no clash of divine wills. The gods and powers of Egypt are not only no match for Yahweh, they're not even in the same weight class. Yahweh undermines and humiliates Egypt, plague after plague. The theology behind the evil dictator is found to have no foundation. Pharaoh matches his divine will to God's and is found severely lacking because this is the Lord, the creator of all, the one who ordered existence from chaos. Exodus keeps pointing us back to God's role as creator because God's power it's not demonstrated in him summoning the plagues, but dismissing them. In his reasserting the created order that he put in place and in holding that order around his chosen people while creation goes amok for the Egyptians. There's an old joke. A scientist comes before God and smugly says, "We no longer need you. We can create life from dirt like you. In fact, we think that we can do it better than you." So God accepts the challenge to the delight of the scientist, who, eager to win, scoops down and picks up some dirt. And God interrupts him and says, "Wait, you have to make your own dirt." The Egyptian magicians and their gods are able to bring about some of the same results. They can turn water to blood. They can summon a plague of frogs. Surprisingly, the powers of Egypt can replicate some of the chaos that God has allowed into his order. But what they can't do is restore order to creation because it's not theirs. It's not their dirt. What they're credited with, the areas that they control or influence, is in fact the dominion of he who created and ordered existence, Yahweh, I am. And so God picks apart the illusion of the Egyptian pantheon, and by proxy, Pharaoh, as the divine ruler. And then he also takes away their cultural superiority. The ancient Egyptians are credited with inventing medicine. They had capabilities and understanding and approaches beyond what most cultures of the time had. So Yahweh afflicts the most medically advanced culture of the time, the pioneers of medicine, with boils that they can't cure. He reasserts his dominion over creation through the plagues. In Genesis, God brings order to the waters. In Exodus, he turns it to blood. In Exodus, he creates creatures from the water, from the earth and the air. In Genesis, he calls frogs, lice, and flies. Domesticated animals from the under Egyptian stewardship die to pestilence. Plants and crops are destroyed by hail and locusts. And the pretty cool gods, pretty powerless to do anything. And then Yahweh undoes his first act of ordering of the universe in Genesis. In Genesis, he says, "Let there be light." In Exodus, he says, "Let there be darkness." And through this all, Pharaoh's provided at each point the opportunity to let the Israelites go over and over again. And each time the God king, who was so dismissive of the God of slaves, who considered Yahweh to be beneath him, now he starts to try and bargain and deal. You can go only if you stay in the city. You can go, but only the men. You can go, but only if you let your animals stay. Except now, it's Yahweh, through Moses, who doesn't bargain. Because he's showing his people and all the people of Egypt that he has no equal. And so there's no dialogue to be opened here. Pharaoh keeps trying to exercise his divine will. He says he'll let them go, and then he changes his mind. He hardens his heart. And so when we get this shift halfway through this narrative, where God hardened Pharaoh's heart, I think that this is what the writers of Exodus are trying to point out. Pharaoh keeps trying to enforce his divine will. The God of Egypt can give or take away, and he does so by going back on his word repeatedly. So God, humiliatingly, also takes away his agency. Yahweh commits him to the path that he's already chosen, and Pharaoh's stubbornness now becomes the way that his false claim to divine sovereignty is exposed. So we're left with the complete dismantling of the power of the Egyptian empire, the impotence of their pantheon. Their gods powerless, their god king emptied of his agency, his divine power revealed as a facade. We get the sense that Pharaoh feels this because at the end, he loses his cool. He is finished with this whole thing. He's done dealing with Moses and this slave god that he has such condescension for. So he tells Moses to never come back to him on penalty of death. But more importantly, in all of this, we see the Lord in his first named appearance to Israel as Yahweh, the God of Abraham. I am who I am, demonstrating the glory and honor owed to him, the creator of all, the one who ordered creation and is not distant but close at hand, asserting his position over all, reminding Israel and us as we read this, that not only did he alone create all, but he alone continues to reign over all creation. There was a custom, a religious ceremony observed in the ancient Middle East that would have been prevalent in Egypt called a threshold covenant. It had to do with dedication and protection of households and families. See, the Middle East of the time had a view that the threshold, the doorway, the entrance to your house, was more than just the way that you got into your home. Crossing the threshold represented crossing some kind of sacred boundary. There was an implied covenant of protection and provision that was owed to guests, owed by the homeowner. But it was also believed to be divinely enforced, blessed by whatever God the home declared allegiance to. The home became a personal sacred space, shielded by divine power. The bond with whatever God was formalized by brushing blood on the doorway. And this protection and blessing would be expected to keep ill-intending spiritual forces at bay, to provide blessing and prosperity to your house by this chosen deity. There is a final act in the part of this story, a last plague to match the creation narrative that actually hasn't been addressed yet. In Genesis, God orders the waters, calls light into being, creates creatures of the sea, land, and air, beasts of burden to be domesticated, plants to grow and harvest. And then he created humankind, and breathed life first into Adam, then Eve. In Exodus, we've seen Yahweh demonstrate his control by removing his order, then imposing it again on creation, in every category except for this one, over life. So the last plague is death. God is prepared to deliver this final judgment that will allow the Israelites to be free from Egypt. But this one comes about differently. In the previous plagues, the Israelites were spared from the effects as a matter of course. God sustained order around them, even as he undid the perceived authority of the empire of Egypt. This is the culmination of what God said he would do in chapter 6. He has revealed himself by name to them. He's demonstrated his power over all, and he's reminded them that he's the Lord of creation and order. But now, this time, there's instructions and specific conditions to be protected from God's judgment of Egypt. And part of it looks actually very familiar to the people of the time. You must have an unblemished animal, a year-old male. You may take it from either the sheep or the goats. You are to keep it until the 14th day of this month, and then the whole assembly of the community of Israel will slaughter the animals at twilight. They must take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts at the lintel of the houses where they eat them. God invokes the threshold covenant ritual, but builds on it and institutes the Passover for Israel, communicating to everyone around the Israelites are under his divine protection. God is so much greater than the powers of Egypt, and so too his Passover is greater than this common ritual, because it points to something and someone greater. Yahweh follows through. Throughout Egypt, there's not a single home unaffected by this plague. Loss abounds through the land. Wailing and mourning pervades. It says there was not a house without someone dead. God promised judgment on the gods of Egypt, and this was the final blow. The vast and mighty pantheon of Egypt, who the people would have been making covenants for protection from spiritual forces with, are shown to be paper tigers, as Yahweh imposes his will across the land, crossing every threshold, regardless of what God they ascribe to, except for the ones dedicated to him. And Pharaoh, the God King, the embodiment of divine right and will, is specifically not exempted from this. 430 years in Egypt ends here. The empire that declared they had a divine right to try and eradicate a generation of Hebrew boys sees their future taken away from them overnight. Pharaoh is done. He's finished, outmatched, defeated. He summoned Moses and Aaron during the night and said, "Get out immediately from among my people, both you and the Israelites, and go. Worship the Lord as you have said. Take even your flocks and your herds if you have asked, and leave. And also bless me. No more." Pharaoh disregarded God at the beginning. His word to the Israelites was more. Now Pharaoh says, no more. No more. He tells them to leave, and for the first time, actually finally humbles himself before Yahweh. He asks for a blessing. He outwardly recognizes the power disparity between them. No longer considering this a dialogue between equals or between different spheres of power, he asks for a blessing, recognizing finally that Yahweh's power is even over him. And then he lets them leave. In a lot of ways, this appears to wrap up nicely. The perfect storybook ending, right? The evil empire gives way to the will of Yahweh. The vast lineup of gods proved powerless. The God King broken and hollow. Israelites freed after over 400 years of oppression. The toil and labor used to break their spirit and keep them captive, left in the ashes as they leave Egypt. The people of God are free, right? The problem is not really, not yet. After this big show of power by Yahweh directly against other gods, they repeatedly choose to serve other masters. In Egypt, the empire demanded the lives of their sons. But then in their idol worship, Israel later goes on to freely offer their own children in sacrifices. Enslaved and broken and bound to their desires, Israel went on to kill prophets, speaking the voice of God that called them to repent. In Egypt, Pharaoh threatened to kill Moses when he spoke for God. Israel goes on to actually do it. Enslaved to legalism, we see an entire new religious sect that shows up in Jesus' time, devoted to literally measuring steps to tell us if they're good enough. God frees Israel from meaningless labor in Egypt, yet Israel then turns even the gift of God's law into a mechanism of increased labor and control and self-justification. More would be enough. So what seemed at first like a perfect ending is now seeming kind of bleak. It's a twisted fairy tale moral. But there's hope here, especially for the future of God's people and for us now. Because what seems like the end of a chapter actually points forward to Jesus. There's a hidden cliffhanger in the plagues, and there's an answer in the rituals God requires of his children. He gives Israel the Passover, a familiar ritual taken up and transformed by God into a sign of trust, protection, and deliverance. Each household is to take a year-old male from the sheep or goats, whole and without defect. Blood placed on the doorway is a sign that this household has heard Yahweh's warning and placed its trust in him. The judgment passing through Egypt threatens every firstborn, but Yahweh provides a way of rescue. The life of the Passover lamb symbolically stands in for the firstborn of the household. And Yahweh stands guard over the blood-marked doorway, protecting the family from the destroyer. This is not merely an escape from death, it's the beginning of Israel's liberation from Pharaoh and its new life under Yahweh. And he commands Israel to repeat this meal every year. Passover turns the story of deliverance into a practiced memory. Their children were asked, why do we do this? And every generation will answer by placing itself in the story. Yahweh rescued us from slavery and brought us out from Egypt. They're called to remember, not to just preserve information, but so that God's rescue will continue to shape their identity, their allegiance, and hope. The rituals carried by Israel for 1,500 years until the coming of Jesus. And then Israel is once again serving other masters, other gods who demand more. They think God is going to free them from another empire. And he is, just not the one that they're thinking of. It's the one that they've carried with them. Their new slave masters lying to them again that more will be enough. But it's doing it from inside their hearts. And in Jesus, we have the Passover again. In Jesus, God renews this form of threshold covenant. Sealed by the blood of Christ, he offers this covenant of blessing and protection, a relationship with all people who would choose to be his children. Through Jesus, we come under the power of the Almighty, creating and ordering King of the cosmos. The blood not on our physical doorways, but on our hearts. In Jesus, the Passover lamb is also the sacrifice for the life God would take. Jesus enters death voluntarily, breaking death's grip from within, and rises to lead a new exodus, to take us out of slavery. And in Jesus, God demonstrates his dominion over creation and order. And this is the resolution to that cliffhanger that I brought up. Because every plague in Egypt, God restored to order, except for one. And we don't really realize it until Jesus. Because death is a part of the order of things, after all. Isn't it? But then Jesus is raised from the dead. And we remember that death entered the world through that first lie, and not actually as part of God's design and order. And that piece of chaos has sat within creation ever since, to the point that we now consider it the natural order of things. But it isn't. It wasn't present when God looked at creation and said that it was good. And in the plagues, I told you, the authority of God is demonstrated not in the calling of the chaos that's in the plagues, but in the restoring them back to order. He who ordered existence demonstrates his power over the Egyptian gods by putting things back how they should be. Yahweh, who brought order from chaos, demonstrates his control over death, not in taking life, but by giving it in a resurrected Jesus. And so we stand on this side of Exodus, like the Israelites. We have a covenant with Yahweh, a Passover lamb sacrificed for us to live. God has reaffirmed to us his power over all things by redoing his creation work. One of my favorite theologically nerdy words is this Greek word, anamnesis. It is it's a word that describes a type of remembering, a recollection, a way of remembering a past moment that draws it more into the present, points us to the future. We talk about it most frequently theologically in the context of the Lord's table, of taking communion. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you declare the Lord's death until he comes. We remember the death and resurrection of Jesus in the present, in a way that awakens the present implications and the present effects and points us to the future a fulfillment of his promise. God says to Israel in Exodus, this day is to be a memorial for you. And Jesus says to us, do this in remembrance of me. Yahweh calls Israel to a real remembrance. Jesus calls us to a real remembrance. Israel lived with this call to anamnesis for 1,500 years, called into a real recollection of the saving power of the only worthy God, to be rescued and kept rescued by remembering who he is and what he did for them. We now live in the same call to anamnesis, called to a real recollection of the saving power of the only worthy God, to be rescued and to be kept rescued in the new covenant made with him through his blood. Israel ran to other gods, other empires, other masters, ones that dwell within all of us, ones who demanded more, broke the spirits of the people, and now we sit in that same space. Will we remember who saved us? Who demonstrated their power and authority and place above all other gods? You know, we might not believe in other gods, but do we still serve them anyways? And when they demand more, do we try and attain more, hoping that our outside behaviors will somehow filter into an inward change? Do we try and obtain more, believing that we're free of masters, but actually just serving another oppressive empire that will just keep adding labor to our quotas? When we analyze our hearts, when we really look, are we really different than the Israelites running off to worship false gods? Or were they more honest because they actually named them? Or are we Pharaoh, serving powers and masters, but thinking we're the ultimate authority in our little kingdoms, matching our will against a gracious liberator? Will we remember what Christ has done, what we've been freed from? There is only one master that doesn't demand that we arbitrarily increase our work. One who demonstrated his dominion over all the powers, one who reminds us of just who ordered creation and holds it in place. This is a reminder and a call for all of us now. Every day we're invited into Exodus, to stop serving powerless gods, to stop running back into slavery, to stop being driven to more, all through Jesus. Who else stands above everything? Who else cradles the universe in his hands and chooses to show us why no other power or God or master is worth serving? So now, when we ask, what will be enough? He answers, I am.